okay, but that's the rationale for them, is because the branch, that the country of the branch wants to levy further tax, and this provision says they can't. But if they have a branch tax, then they would have a little provision in the treaty to say the branch tax is okay and it's going to be respected under the terms of the treaty. So they'd have a carve-out for it, which is how they get by. The interesting thing here is a branch can be taxed more favourably than a subsidiary. So it's actually just looking at it as to whether it's being taxed better or worse. And there are some countries that encourage investment through branches and even have different means of calculating the profits, particularly on things like insurance commissions and stuff like that. It could be on a percentage of turnover rather than on profits. And then you'd have to look at both calculations to say, well, is this actually more favourable in your particular case? And there's a line of Swedish tax cases in this area that's quite interesting. But this is in a little bit like, how many of you are looking at European Union tax? Are you going to do the EU tax law course? Is anybody doing the EU course? Yeah, you. You'll be covering lots of similar lines of thought like this in relation to the European Union, because that too doesn't allow discrimination between investments between one member state and another. And it's much like this. So that's an interesting provision. Then we come to Article 25. You see, I'm just going through all the provisions that we sort of skipped over a little bit during the course of this term. This is the mutual agreement procedure. It's a procedure where if the taxpayer doesn't think they've got the right answer, they can possibly go to the competent authorities of a state and ask for clarity on the interpretation of a treaty. But this is more often than not used in relation to other disputes. It can be used in relation to disputes on interpretation, but most of the time this is used for, what do you think? What sort of disputes are there lots and lots of? Transfer pricing, yeah. Most of the time this would be used for transfer pricing disputes to try and resolve a situation where one country says, well, we want to increase the profits, and the taxpayer is saying, well, we've only got so much profits. If you've got the right arm's length price and you're increasing the profits, I need to have an equal and corresponding reduction somewhere else. So that's the mutual agreement procedure, and it's got some focus in there. It's not a great timeline that everybody has to abide by, but they try to start to say these disputes must be resolved within certain periods of time, and this is the process for taking these disputes on. That's really what this provision is doing. There's Article 30, which is only in the OECD model and not in the UN model, which basically extends territory for the purposes of tax. And very often this is in countries where in the waters that belong to them, or actually beyond the waters that belong to them, there might be exploration, oil extraction, precious commodities, things like that, where the tax rule for the country is extended to cover other things too. And of course, where you've got this sort of territorial extension, it's going to be in a treaty negotiated by two countries. So, for example, there's a territorial extension between the UK and Norway, which you'd expect to be, because there's a body of water between the UK and Norway, and there's lots of oil underneath it. So, North Sea oil, who's got the right to tax? You'd look to the Norwegian treaty, you'd look at the territorial extension, and you'd get some sort of basis for helping to resolve that through that. and there will be other countries that need that sort of provision. Then there's an entry into force provision. Again, it's very important. We've got lots of changes happening to treaties at the moment. Lots and lots of changes as a result of BETS, the multilateral instrument. So it's very important to work out when the treaty and the provision you're actually looking at comes into force. The treaty may come into may be ratified in two countries at two different times, because countries will have different procedures for ratifying a treaty. One might do it in March and one might do it in July. So we have to look at the date that the treaty comes into force, and it's normally on the date of the exchange of the instruments of ratification, which tends to be just after the second country has ratified the treaty. But it's important to look at when it comes into force and make sure you know that. And then it can be terminated. But if it's terminated, then there's a requirement to give 6 months' notice, which makes sense, because otherwise a taxpayer is disadvantaged through something that's outside of their control. And it can be terminated simply through diplomatic channels, so it's quite easy to terminate treaties. Although the tendency over the last several years is that once the treaty in place, it's always in place. There's very few that have been terminated. I think I mentioned the treaty between Indonesia and Mauritius, one that had been terminated and was subject of the Indofoods case, but very seldom are treaties terminated, and there is a sort of a suggestion coming out of BETS that countries ought to think a little bit more about whether they do want treaties, whether it's beneficial for them to have treaties, and if it's not, to think about terminating them. And suggesting that countries think long and hard before they enter into a treaty. Does it make sense for them to do it? And suggesting that countries don't just have treaties for the sake of saying, I've got 100 treaties, aren't I an international country? There's a suggestion that countries should be much more careful than that. But it's easy to terminate them. The repercussions of terminating them might not be very nice, but in terms of doing it, it's not too difficult. Partnerships, I don't really want to say a great deal about partnerships, other than partnerships are different to companies. The main thing is that lots of countries, when you look at them, the domestic law of lots of countries, countries will have companies and they will have partnerships. And they have partnerships in the sense of a group of individuals acting together in partnership. But you can also have companies acting with individuals in partnerships. You can have things that look like they're partnerships but have corporate liability. And you can have things that look like companies and the liability is almost as if it was a partnership. It rests on the shareholders rather than on the partnership itself. So all the things that I've talked about this year are really about companies. I've not talked about partnerships. So there are different rules, and when you do read some articles in the press, which are complicated articles in the press, some of the comments will be about partnerships rather than about companies. So just be aware that it's different, and a lot of work has gone into the application of the OECD model to partnerships. I've just given the France-UK treaty for those that are interested, which actually has a definition of partnership and takes you through the flow of how you decide whether you've got a partnership or a company. Now, treaty interpretation is a much